A question hangs over Russia. Is it true that its population meekly absorbs tyranny without rising up? And if so, why? The internet's answer is 3 words: the slavery gene. Before we deconstruct that answer, we've got to look at what makes it seem true, which is a few sources of Russian cultural passivity. One of the sources of Russian cultural passivity is language. It's a language that makes it hard to escape out of the passive voice. Do you want ice cream? Yes, I want ice cream. In Russian, a wanting for ice cream has come over me. Now let's move to football. So why did you lose the match? Не получилось. It hasn't turned out. Не пошло. It didn't get going. Не вышло. It didn't come off. Не удалось. It didn't succeed. Now, excuse me, you lost the match and you are speaking as though you weren't there. So sporting failure descends like rain from the sky without agency. If you try this level of passivity in English, you'll look suspicious. For instance, mistakes were made is a cliché of political dishonesty in English, but in Russian it sounds normal. Now here is the problem. Ukrainian is passive too. Does this make Ukrainians passive? Yes, Ukrainian language takes Ukrainians toward passivity, but Ukrainians have myths and ideals that give them access to political agency and take them out of the kind of political resignation that besets most Russians. You can see some of that difference on the front line. On average, Ukrainian soldiers deal with tragedy and triumph with a bit more agency. And as a result, they feel a bit fresher and a bit less alien to us Westerners. Though partly that's about Ukrainians knowing why they're at the front, whereas the Russian soldiers mostly don't. The second source of Russian passivity is the fog of history. So just like in our first point, agency disappears from language, here judgment disappears from the sense of the past. When the USSR collapsed, Soviet crimes became undeniable. But instead of a civic reckoning with the past, Russia collapsed into depoliticization, humiliation, and inequality. The past became just debris available for reuse. The idea was not to rehabilitate Stalin as a communist, but to rehabilitate him as a blank slate onto which anyone could project anything they want. And on my last few visits to Russia in the late 2010s, I noticed this. A bust of Stalin went up in the city, and much of the cultural elite were trying to justify this in terms of, we don't know what he was really about, but he couldn't have been that bad. So Stalin became a criminal, a hero, an effective manager, a necessary evil, left-wing, right-wing, depending on the day of the week. The only definite fact about him was that he was there, central in Russian history. So Russia made, in a very strange way, the legacy of Stalin undecidable. Levada polls, which we should take with a pinch of salt, have shown a rise in positive attitude towards Stalin as a cipher. In 2019, Levada found that 70% of Russians approved of Stalin's role in Russian history, a record at the time. In 2025, Stalin again appeared at the top of Levada's most outstanding people ranking. Now, how old is this stuff? The 1990s, roughly. That is when Russia began to post-truthicate its own history. And this got intensified in the Putin era, especially starting from that slot 2012 to 2014, when Putinist propaganda intensified and Putin aligned himself in a Wagnerian way with the cultural destiny of the Russian people. So don't underestimate how much this is caused by Russian propaganda. In part, this is a case of people thinking X because of the power other people have over them. The third source of Russian passivity is the normal country trap, which is a kind of Fukuyamian passivity with a racist twang. You can immediately recognize this when Russians talk about joining the civilized world, and when asked about what kind of future they want for their country, they answer a normal one. It's a naive form of teleology. It assumes that there is a singular thing called democratic capitalism, and some countries are meant to join it. This is roughly early Fukuyama plus racism, because on the Russian picture of it, only white people are expected to join it. and join is the word. This is a passive picture of politics in which your future is something you join, not something you build and create. You outsource your future to a magical idea of the West, which is of course ludicrous because the West is no one thing. It's a bunch of different political systems that have a lot in common, and it's also a bunch of struggling political systems. So you can't just join the West without actually having active proposals to how to solve some of the problems the West is facing that it can't itself solve right now. And of course, the kind of passive anti-communism of this view is particularly ironic because it subscribes to a kind of primitive view of historical progress and economic determinism that primitive Marxism subscribes to. And this is why John Gray likes to remark that in the 20th century, in 1917 and in the 1990s, Russia was a site of two experiments in Western utopia, Marxist-Leninism and neoliberalism, both agreeing with one another on some very caricatural ideas about how if you fix the economy, everything else follows. And I was a victim of this depoliticized idealization of the West as a child. I left the Soviet Union aged 9 in 1990. And before I left, I thought the West was a kind of utopia in which not only the politics and the economics were got right, but people's inner lives were also tranquil. And this exasperatingly naive view flourished not just among children, but among adults at the end of the Soviet experiment. A fourth source of Russian passivity is territorial passivity. And here I direct us to the videos we did at the time that Ukraine invaded Russia into the Kursk Oblast. Many Russians don't experience their country as a country, but as a territory on which there is a political authority that happens to rule them. This is a colonial relationship with Russian power that Russians have, which means that their sense of their borders are flexible, because if this political authority goes and another one comes along and our borders change in the process, then perhaps who cares? Given this, this is a moment to ask, but not answer, Andrei Zorin's question. What would it mean for Russian culture to survive, and indeed flourished, if Russia ceased to exist as a state? A fifth source of Russian passivity is propaganda, which we mentioned a moment ago. As the great Dutch philosopher Spinoza taught us, you can't compel belief. But you can force people politically to shut up. And if you keep people inarticulate about their beliefs long enough, in a majority, those beliefs begin to retreat into the subconscious. And Putin's regime has run a quarter-century experiment in drilling it into people's heads that they are alone and that all attempts at collective political action are futile. Now, the Soviet Union also encouraged passivity among citizens who didn't want to sing the ideological song of the day, until glasnost in the late 1980s. But it was brief, and it was also encouraged from the top. Gorbachev told people, you can gather and you can speak. And very soon Putin confiscated this. So we've said a bit about distinctively Russian passivity, but in many ways, Russian passivity is not distinctive at all. Russia also strikingly represents two forms of modern passivity that are global and affect you wherever you are in the world. Now, the first source of global passivity that is not original or unique to Russia is a product of an ethical failure. The ethical failure is caused by value liquidity, which makes strangers feel ethically unreal. A philosopher would call this a collapse of thin relations. Thin ethical relations, the relations you have with strangers. Thick relations, the relations you have with people you actually know. And what we've got is a global crisis, whereby people care about the people they know, but increasingly their care for strangers has collapsed from low to nothing. Late philosopher Alistair MacIntyre gives us a stark image of where this comes from. Imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe. Laboratories are burned down, books and instruments are destroyed. Later, enlightened people seek to revive science, although they have largely forgotten what it was. All they possess are fragments, parts of theories, instruments whose use has been forgotten, half chapters from books, single pages from articles, torn and charred. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry and biology. Children learn by heart the surviving portions of the periodic table and recite as incantations some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they're doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all. Those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they're doing have been lost, perhaps irreversibly. The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of the natural science in the imaginary world I described. Let's break down MacIntyre's provocation. What MacIntyre is saying is that we still use words like human rights, freedom, dignity, justice, but the social fabric needed for us to use these words coherently is mostly gone. This hits thin relations hard. Thick relations survive the collapse of moral language better because they're based on memory, love, loyalty, a shared history and a common life. So how screwed are we? We have three possible responses. The first response is local and pessimistic. Moral life has collapsed at the level of large modern societies, so serious ethical life can only now be preserved in smaller communities. This is MacIntyre's view, and it's pessimistic. Second, we have a liberal reconstructive response. The collapse is real, but it is partial and mostly reversible. We can rebuild a shared moral language. This response is optimistic. Third, we have a tragic reconstructive response. The loss is mostly irreversible, but we can maintain rational hope in a partial reconstruction. We can live truthfully without despair with what we have left, and we can improve thin relations without a reconstruction of moral language. We should try for this. We don't know if it will work. Time will tell. This response is realistic. It is Nietzsche's response, probably, and also mine. Now let's move on. The second source of global passivity that's not unique to Russia is a product of a political failure. Social liquidity, making people find politics unreal. So if the ethical failure makes people find strangers morally unreal because of value liquidity, the political failure makes citizens find politics unreal because of social liquidity. So this is about a word I use a lot, which is depoliticization. What happens is that people stop engaging with politics, or they engage with politics non-politically, as a vehicle for consumption or identity expression, or they engage with politics destructively because it doesn't make sense to them and that makes them very frightened and they want to destroy it. Of course, there is individual failure, but this is not mainly a story about individual failure. It's not reducible to people being stupid or people being morally malign. It's a product of social forces out in the world making our societies more liquid. Here is Mark Liller.
I would have liked to deliver a sermon calling on the defenders of democracy to man the barricades and fight for our values. But the deeper forces that are at work in our societies today will have a more profound effect on us and on you and on the Ukrainians than the current situation will. If we really want to protect our democracies, our first task intellectually is to understand these forces, which are not local, they are not national, they're global. They're everywhere in the world today. For me, it was a revealing fact that in the early weeks of the current war, very few Russians demonstrated against the war for understandable reasons. Even fewer demonstrated for the war or rushed to enlist in the military. Instead, what did most Russians do? They rushed to IKEA to buy furniture before the store closed for good.
Now, I don't know what social forces Mark Liller is talking about, but he probably has a similar view to mine, and I list at least four. Number one, the state of the internet enclosing us in a world of mental and fact bubbles. Number two, individualistic ideologies of self-realization that preclude citizens dealing with one another in terms of solidarity and a common belonging to a shared polity. Number three, the untethering of social bonds. Number four, exclusion and profound inequality of economic power. In Russia, inequality is extreme, and that's why the best commentators on Russia, like Dmitry Gluchovsky and Greg Yudin, say that Russia breaks down into two classes. A class who can call somebody when they're in trouble, and a class who have nobody to call. When the privileged class runs into arbitrary power, they can call Igor Ivanovich, who can call Ivan Igorovich, who can sort the problem for them. But the majority have nobody to call. Both the moral failure and the political failure are global trends that aren't original to Russia, that aren't unique to Russia, but which Russia represents in an extreme form. Because Russia expresses these two problems extremely, it is a vanguard, and that means that we can learn from it. Because seeing failures we've got at home on a smaller scale more dramatically expressed in another country is an extraordinary opportunity for learning and also for preventing the worst things that are coming your way from coming your way to the fullest extent that they can. And actually, much history, much of what it means to do history is about this activity of seeing something dramatically expressed somewhere else and learning from that how to relate to the fact that the same thing is on a smaller scale expressed where you are. Now we get to the so-called Russian slavery gene. Now, what do people mean when they talk about it? Number one, nobody intellectually serious talks about it. Number two, when it's talked about, it's meant more as an insult than as an explanation. However, the problem with it is that it's an insult to everyone, including the person making it, and not just to Russians. It invites us to regard a group of human beings as not belonging to a category to which in fact all humans belong. So it is a version of fascist ideology, or at least soft fascism. When you call Russians the slave gene people and invite Americans, Brits, Germans, Swedes, Australians to join you, you're inviting them to create a category of inferiority that in fact cannot apply to any human grouping, and that is insulting. Now, here is why it's impossible. Could human beings evolve so as to impact their moral capacities? Sure, but that evolution takes a very long time. As far as your moral psychology goes, you are the same as Aristotle, who was born 2,400 years ago. Your moral psychology is hugely inflected by culture, and cultural difference is profound across historical time. But it is still the same human psychology. Therefore, the rate of evolution means that no human grouping could evolve into anything radically different over a period of 1,000 years. And therefore, either all of us have some kind of item we could call the slavery gene, or none of us do. And none of us do. Now, one of the things I haven't mentioned is how Russian passivity is a product of universal features of human psychology. There is the cultural passivity unique to Russia that we discussed. There are the global trends and failures that are not unique but extreme in Russia. And then there is the passivity of universal psychology. I won't elaborate on this except to give one example. We can see that evil that succeeds is harder to see as evil if you are associated with it. Now, where in my library of videos do I recommend you go next? If you join me after 2023, I recommend you watch this, a video about how Russia's sense of history contains a sense of destiny without a sense of progress.